I just want to hear what Judy has to say, and then we'll start.
Sure.
Okay. My grandfather's brother survived in the ghetto, and
Budapest, you mean?
when we were in Budapest, I think you met his granddaughter, my second cousin.
Ah, yes. So that's why there are more survivors of Hungarian Jews than most other Jewish communities, because a couple of 100,000, I think 100,000 Hungarian Jews survived the war, which was one of the largest numbers. But they were in the ghetto in Budapest. But many were killed in that 5-6 month period by the Hungarian fascists.
And the mother, which was the daughter of this uncle, she survived. Somebody hit her because she was blonde, and she went over to Pest, and they hit her.
Yeah.
Wow.
All right, friends. So that's what we're doing today. We're remembering them with honor and with love, and we win by studying Psalms and being Jews all these years later. This is the great victory of the Jewish people, even though many, many, many were murdered. Yeah. So
Today-
please feel free in chat to put the names of any relatives or those you're thinking of who died in the Shoah, who we remember, and particularly because it's the liberation of Auschwitz today. We're thinking very much about those who died there and those who were liberated. Okay, so today sorry, Harold.
Well, Ira, actually, today's Ira's day. He has a little
great.
present for us.
Okay.
Ira?
Good morning, everyone. And as I wrote in the chat, I'm dedicating this to my mother's family, most of whom I believe died in the Warsaw Ghetto, but I don't even know their names.
Uh-huh.
But it's to
There are
them.
many we don't know their names, and we hold their memories.
Yes. So today I thought I would offer two pieces by Salomone Rossi. Most of you should be familiar with Rossi, especially if you've come to CBST's Kol Nidre services, because the CBST choir always sings at the after the Amida a beautiful setting of Rossi, Elohim Hashivenu. But today we're going to be listening to Psalms 121 and 118. Now Rossi, we don't know exactly when he was born or when he died. We think around 1570 he was born and died around 1628. So he was a very important bridge composer who spanned the late Renaissance into the Baroque. And in fact, he was a prolific composer of secular music, both instrumental and vocal, although we know him primarily as Jews for his contribution to Jewish music, which is what I'm going to focus on today. Rossi claimed that he was a descendant of an Italian Jewish family that actually was brought to Rome from Jerusalem under Titus. I could not find any exact, real factual documentation, but several of the articles I read about him did refer to that. And he often would attach the name to his name. He would append the word Hebreo at the end, meaning Hebrew. And he was very proud of his Jewish heritage. And in fact, at that time, Italy, of course, was not a unified country, so it was made up of a lot of duchies and city-states and whatnot. Rossi served in the court of Mantua from 1587 to 1628 and worked with such prominent composers there as Claudio Monteverdi. However, I want to focus on the output of his Jewish works, because they're very important in that he was really the first Jewish composer that we know of to set Jewish music to a full mixed choir in Hebrew that was not cantorial or based on ancient modes. So his work that he published in 1623 was called Hashirim Asher LeShlomo. Now, you would think with that title, it would have something to do with Shir Hashirim, Asher LeShlomo, but in fact, nothing from Shir HaShirim was part of this collection. So we think he was making a little pun on his own name, which in Hebrew would have been Shlomo, Salamoni. And these are the songs of Salamoni. These works are, there are a few dozen of them, and many of them are psalms, but not all of them. He said some piyutim, he said a version of the Kaddish, and they're gorgeous, gorgeous works, which basically got totally forgotten after Mantua was invaded by Austrian troops in 1630. And it's possible that Rossi died in that invasion. We don't really know. But in fact, it took about 200 years for these works to be rediscovered. When Baron Edmund de Rothschild was on a trip to Italy, and he stumbled on this collection of old music books bearing the name Salamone Rossi Ebreo. And he took these manuscripts back to Paris with him and offered them to the cantor of the Great Synagogue of Paris. And so in 1876, the first modern version of Rossi's music was published. So let's go to Psalm 121 and listen to Rossi's beautiful setting of this. If you were at the CBST concert a couple of years ago, I don't remember what year, the one that was a Psalm Enchanted Evening, you would have heard the CBST chorus singing this piece.
Thank you so much, Ira. That's gorgeous.
Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous.
Yes, his works are quite beautiful.
Thank you very much, Ira.
You're
I
very
was
welcome.
hoping you would sing it yourself.
If I could sing soprano, alto, tenor, and bass.
I have full confidence in you, Ira. All right, today is part of our introduction to Psalm 16. I'm going to digress a bit to talk a little bit about the Bratslav Hasidim and Nachman of Bratslav, because this Psalm 16 is the first of what's known as the Tikkun HaKlali. And here what I have this as a, this is an example of a, is that in there? Can you see that?
We can see that, yes.
Okay. So this is an example of, this is published by the contemporary community of the Bratslav Hasidim. And they have these, a lot of these that are these little wadi mekums. That's how we pronounce that in rabbinical school, Harold. I'm not sure how you would say that in correct Latin. Vadi mekum, probably something, right?
That's fine, you're fine.
Okay.
There's a million ways.
Okay, but we would, in our Americanized Latin, would say a wadi mekum is a handbook, something you could carry around. That's like I consider my Tehillim or a small reference book as a handbook you could carry around. So this is a booklet that's produced today. This is totally contemporary by the Bratslav Hasidim. And it has these 10 Psalms, which begins with Psalm 16, with prayers before, prayers after. And for a Bratslav Hasid, it's traditional to recite these 10 Psalms every single day. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and who the Bratslav Hasidim are as a way into a very fascinating story within the Jewish people. And as mentioned yesterday, Connie Kurtz had 2 children, and they're both in Israel. Ruthie, are you here today? Is Ruthie here today with us?
Ruthie had to step away.
Oh, she had to step away. So I'll wait to say too much about them. But one of them, when he was 12 years old, long before moving to Israel, basically, Ruthie can remember the actual story. But somehow when he was 12 years old, it was revealed to him, or he understood that he was a Bratslav Chassid in Brooklyn. And he became, as a young person, a Bratslav Chassid, and now lives in Tiberias with his many, many children and many, many grandchildren. And Tiberias is one of the centers of the Bratslav Chassidim today. There's also, obviously, Bratslav Chassidim in Brooklyn and in Jerusalem, and some in Tzfat, but mostly in Tiberias, Jerusalem, Tzfat, and Brooklyn. So who are the Bratslav Chassidim? Let me just give you a little bit of background. There's a lot to say about them, but I'll say this because this Psalm 16 plays such an interesting place with them. So the Bratslav Chassidim follow, and I'm going to type it in the chat so people can see. It's Rabbi Nachman. Let me just write this for those who Nachman of Bratslav. But sometimes you'll see it Breslau or Breslav. There are a few different ways that the name of the town in western Ukraine, Bratslav is in western Ukraine, is pronounced. But I put the name there so everybody can really hear this. So Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav was a Hasidic Rebbe in the late 1700s, early 1800s. He died at the age of 38. Which I don't think was so uncommon then, but it's very young. It's still shockingly young. I don't think it was common, but he died very young. So he was what is Hasidim, first of all? In a very brief way to be able to place Nachman in this. So there was a Magid, a storyteller named the Baal Shem Tov, which was not his real name, it was his title, who died in 1770. That's important to understand the relationship to Nachman. And he also was from Ukraine, so Ukraine and Galicia, or Galicia, whichever way you want to pronounce it, is in the southern part of Eastern Europe. So if we imagine Eastern Europe, and if Darina is here, she'll understand these things in ways that Americans often don't. So Eastern Europe is a huge swath that goes north to south, from Lithuania up in the north to Ukraine, Galicia in the south. And if you looked at a map, you would see all these countries of Eastern Europe, and there's Central Eastern Europe, there's Western Eastern Europe, and they're very, very different. But for Jews of Eastern Europe, we were from an area called the Pale of Settlement, which was by law where Jews could live. And so it was this strip from the north in Lithuania down to the south in Ukraine, Galicia. The north was wealthier, more educated. The south was poor and often illiterate in the Jewish community. So those are huge distinctions to understand. If you were from the north, there was the Jewish community had Many schools of education, yeshivot, were very prominent. Many famous rabbis from the north. It was kind of like where, if you imagine the north, so Lithuania and the northern part of Eastern Europe was like the Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Oh, look at that. Harold, thank you. Fantastic. So if we look at the north, and again, it's a strip, so it's not Central Europe, it's not, Germany and westward. It's what we think of as Poland and Russia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, all those east and down Bessarabia, down to the Black Sea, to Ukraine and Galicia. For Jews, now, the borders changed between Russia and Poland 3 very significant times. There's a lot I can say about that, and sometimes if I teach this history, I'll teach it to you. That's why sometimes people say, oh, my family's from Russia. No, it was Poland. No, it was Russia. 3 important times those boundaries changed. Jews stayed in the same place, so that's why sometimes we think of Poland and Russia confused. There were huge boundary changes 3 times in the 1700s, which really affected our community deeply. But so Jews lived in this up to down. North was wealthier, and that doesn't mean wealthy. It just means no starvation. People were highly educated. And in the South, Jews were very, very poor and often illiterate. So that's why there are a lot of jokes made between a Jew who married from Galicia in the south to a Litvak, a Lithuanian in the north. There were huge cultural differences. And it wasn't funny. There were really huge cultural differences, kind of like if a Boston Brahmin married somebody from rural Alabama. In the non-Jewish sense, what the accents in Yiddish were completely different. So in Yiddish, you could hear if somebody was from the highly educated north or from the rural Alabama sounding south. That's how different Yiddish would sound. Like if you imagine in your American, for those of you who are American, your American ears, what it sounds like when you hear somebody from the deep, deep, deep rural south speak, and what it sounds like when you hear somebody, from the Northeast speak. And we who are not European don't understand that in Yiddish, these were serious differences, and the pronunciations targeted you and completely pigeonholed you. Now, not all Eastern European Jews, of course, spoke Yiddish. Let's be clear. Hungarians didn't all speak Yiddish by any means, and Polish Jews didn't all speak Yiddish. Many Polish Jews in Warsaw were, especially the late 1800s and 1900s, cosmopolitan Polish people who spoke Polish. Many Jews who lived in various parts that were Russia spoke Russian. It's just not true that every Jew in Eastern Europe spoke Yiddish, including, by the way, and I'm going to be teaching a whole class about this, Sholem Aleichem, who's so famous as the father of Yiddish literature. He did not speak Yiddish to his children. We think of Yiddish as this only folksy language. These were some of them very highly intellectual people who also spoke Yiddish. Sholem Aleichem spoke Yiddish, but it wasn't the language he spoke to his children or his wife or his family. So going back to, if in the north, highly educated, in the south, very poor. In the south, they were looked down upon as not as good Jews as the northern Jews who were Talmud scholars. The great Talmudic institutions were in the north. The great Talmudic scholars were in the north. The great explosion of Jewish culture was in the north. And in the south, these were poor, illiterate, peasant Jews. I hope I've painted that picture clear enough. All right. Now, of course, there were exceptions. This is a huge generalization. I'm just trying to get everybody to get it. Okay. So in the South comes along a teacher named the Baal Shem Tov, who was part of a larger roaming group of teachers, honestly, not unlike Jesus in his day, who would go around from town to town, and he would teach, and he would use stories to teach rather than Talmud, and he would be very folksy, and he would teach Torah and love, and he would say, it doesn't matter if you're poor, God still loves you. It doesn't matter if you're illiterate, you can be a good Jew. Guess what? That was a very popular teaching in a community that was, for many reasons, beaten down, and I can't go into everything. So in the South, he started spreading this Torah of you can be as close to God if you're poor and illiterate as a Torah scholar up north. All you have to do is to really feel God's presence, follow the Torah, follow the mitzvot, be full of joy, and understand Meloch Kol Haaretz Kavodo. It says that God is found everywhere. So our job as Jews to experience God's holiness everywhere. When you carry, if you're a wood carrier, the Baal Shem Tov would say, if you carry the wood with intention to be close to God and to feel God's joy in your carrying the wood, you're as good a Jew as the Talmud scholar. If you're a water carrier, if you're a wood splitter, if whatever you do, you can be as close to God if you follow the Torah and the mitzvot. You do it with joy and intention. Your kavanah is important. And in many ways, the way Southern cultures, like how Italians look at Scandinavians, they on some level think, okay, we're the ones with fun and with color, and the Scandinavians, they're cold and a little, eh. Well, that's a little bit what the Baal Shem Tov said. We in the South, we might be poor, we might be illiterate, but we know joy. Those Northern Talmud scholars, they're so frozen in their, pill and their study of Talmud and this. We're the ones who know the joy of God. Okay, so that I am doing this as a super, super fast overview. He dies in 1770. The Baal Shem Tov has a small group of followers who are known as the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, and hence the Hasidic movement is born. And the closer the follower is to the life of the Baal Shem Tov, the more power they have. And it becomes, so the first generation is the closest one, because they actually knew the Baal Shem Tov. Then the second generation is closer because they knew the disciples who knew the Baal Shem Tov, etc. Then the third generation is closer, etc., etc. And then, so the first three generations following the Baal Shem Tov in the world of Hasidic literature and theology and power, those first three generations are considered extremely special. Then after those generations, each dynasty passes on to a son or a nephew or a son-in-law their dynasty. And each dynasty starts to fight over who's the more correct lineage back to the original Baal Shem Tov, or to the student of the Baal Shem Tov. And the different students are very, very important. Anyway, so then the world of Hasidism continues, but we're not about that today. So Nachman of Bratslav is born in 1772, 2 years after the Baal Shem Tov dies, and he is the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. That's a big deal. So he's actually not only related to a disciple, he's actually in the lineage of the Baal Shem Tov. He himself, of course, never knew the Baal Shem Tov. He was born 2 years later. But his mother was a granddaughter of the Baal Shem Tov who knew her grandfather. That started out giving him tremendous influence or power. So he was married at age 13, which was totally normal then. And he had 8 children. Only 2 boys, which in their world was a problem, and both boys died in childhood. Several of his other children died in childhood. He had a very, very, very sad and difficult life himself. And he started teaching. He had his first follower who attached to him at his wedding when he was 13 years old. He was known to be an Eloi, a genius, and he studied Talmud. He was a genius. And he started as a teenager developing profound, passionate followers. There's a lot of information here that I won't go into. Suffice it to say he started doing very famous teachings on certain holidays of the year that became very, very well known. And on, he would have, what was very common is that a Hasidic master would teach on a holiday or Shabbat afternoon. But of course, since they didn't write, their students were responsible. Soon as the Shabbat or the holiday was over, they would try to memorize what the Rebbe had said during the holiday. And then soon as sundown happened, they would try and write it down verbatim. And that's how we have the writings of the Nachman of Bratslav. They were written down, and often the Rebbe would speak in Yiddish. They would usually teach in Yiddish, and often the students would write it in Hebrew. So we have a collection of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav's works that are over these years of his teaching, mostly from these special holidays, which I won't go into all. There's so much to say about that. But, and they're collected in a very important and famous book of the collections of his teachings. And it's very famously known. I had to look up the date because I don't honestly know the date of this offhand. But in 1805, he gave a very famous sermon, Drash, where he said that Tehillim, Psalms, have a very special power to them. And that anybody could choose 10 Psalms, any 10 Psalms, and say those 10 Psalms daily to achieve repentance or healing or a complete, what he called a tikkun haklali. A complete tikkun is a remedy or a fixing, like tikkun olam, like fixing of the world. It's a complete fixing, not just medical fixing, by the way. And he talked a lot about the Psalms as having a power for repentance. That was in 1805, that drash. And by the way, for the Bratslav Hasidim who follow this, they now, if you talk to a contemporary Bratslav Hasid, they have memorized these sermons. They know them all by heart. And many of the sermons were in the form of stories. He was very famous for telling stories. And to this day, Bratslav Hasidim will study his stories for their metaphor, for their meaning, for their mystical meaning. I took a class once, by the way, where I studied Likutei Maharan, which is the name of his collection. And some of the stories are downright bizarre. I mean, really Freudian and complicated. But his followers study these stories and know them inside and out. And these stories form the basis. Now, in 1805, he gives this famous sermon where he says, any 10 Psalms. Now, why the number 10? Where did 10 come from? This is a very interesting thing that now I think you'll start to appreciate. I need to get the exact list. But he came up with the number 10 because he said there are 10 kinds of Psalms. Remember we talked about how categorization everybody has a way to categorize Psalms, and Randy gave us a fantastic overview of what the 19th century scholars did in categorizing Psalms. Bratslav had his own way of categorizing Psalms, and he said there were 10 different kinds. He said there are 10 types of songs in Tehillim, songs. Listen to this, and now you'll recognize some of these words you've already learned or heard or seen, and the rest are in other Psalms. In other words, in the superscriptions, he sees 10 as having particular significance. Ashrei, Bracha, Maskil, Nitzuach, which is like Lamanatseach, right? He's using a word, while the word might be different. So Lamanatseach, Shir, like Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat, Nigun, Mizmor, Tefillah, Hoda'ah, and Hallelujah. So he said there are these 10 forms of song that makes up the book of Psalms. And therefore, if you just say any 10 Psalms every day with the right kavanah, you can achieve repentance and also healing in some cases, which I'll leave for now. Then in 1810, which is, I think, the year he actually died, he gave a super famous sermon where he identified there were 10 specific Psalms that he offered his followers as having particular power, beginning with Psalm 16. He gave some insight why he chose those Psalms, but mostly he did not. And since 1810, scholars and his followers have tried to understand those 10 Psalms to varying degrees of accessibility. Whoops, wow. Do you hear that? All those sirens? Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Okay, so so when the year he died, he also was buried. So he wasn't born in Breslov or Bratslav. He was born in Mezhebuzh, which is the town that the Baal Shem Tov is from. Remember, he was the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. He was from the Baal Shem Tov's own family, but he chose to live. He lived in Israel for a while, or Palestine as it was known, in Tiberias, which is why to this day there are many Bratslav Hasidim in Tiberias, or Tveria in Hebrew. And he, when he went back to Eastern Europe, to Ukraine, to Poland, he lived in Braslav. He chose that as his place, and he said, "Here, this name will become forever famous, because my followers will be known by the name of this town." But he was buried in a different town, which he also selected. Also, there's a lot to say about Nachman, and the town he was buried in. Too bad. Yelena isn't here. I don't really know how to pronounce it. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which is not far from Braslav in western Ukraine. It is traditional to this day for Braslav Hasidim to visit his grave on Rosh Hashanah, to recite these 10 Tehillim, because part of what he taught was that if you recited these 10 Tehillim, these 10 Psalms in memory of tzaddikim that came before you, your life will be blessed. So now Umam was in the former Soviet Union. After the communist takeover in 1917 or 1918, the communist revolution, wasn't so easy to get to Umam. Still, Bratslav Hasidim figured out ways to get there. Sometimes they were imprisoned and killed. Guess what? The communist government wasn't so crazy about Hasidic pilgrimages to this grave. Come on, Bella. Come on, Bella. So, since 1989, when the Iron Curtain fell, you can imagine the transformation in the life of Bratslav Hasidim. They will say, and they're probably correct, every single year Bratslav Hasidim made it there for Rosh Hashanah. Secretly, or whatever there, but it would have been a small number. After 1989, when the Iron Curtain is lifted, tens and tens of thousands of Hasidim go there every year. And in fact, there's some thinking that actually the coronavirus was brought back to Israel this year by Hasidim who were doing, the virus was there, who knows. But tens of thousands, mostly men, I don't know if any Bratslav women go, I tend to doubt it, go. And there's a lot of issues because the locals, by and large, like the economic boon. But guess what? The Bratslav Hasidim don't behave so well while they're there. And it sounds a little bit to me, it's a little bit like, you know how the Amish do that crazy thing where they could, as teenagers, they could leave.
Sprungen or something.
Yeah. It sounds a little bit like some of the Bratslav Hasidim act like that when they go to Umam. There's drugs, sex. Doesn't sound like they necessarily behave so puritanically. And there have been lots of complaints over the years, by the way, about these Hasidim who descend on the town. Anyway, back to Nachman. So Nachman is known as the dead, or the Bratslav Hasidim, which continued after he died in 1810, are known as the dead Hasidim, as in death. Because unlike every other Hasidic group, Bratslav did not designate a successor. He did not have sons, but sometimes the Hasidic masters would designate a son-in-law or a nephew or another male relative to take over the leadership. He did not. So the Bratslav Hasidim to this day do not have a living Rebbe. And that's why they're called the dead Hasidim, because they follow a dead Rebbe. If you're interested in knowing more about Nachman, one of the most interesting books I've read, which is kind of like a biography from not inside the world of Bratslav Hasidim, is this book written by my teacher, Arthur Green, called Tormented Master. It's in paperback. It's a big book. It's fantastic reading. And A Life of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. And it's very rare to have a book written by an outsider who is actually an expert, not just a dilettante. So, oh, look, Lori has a copy of that. And Art Green is not a Bratslav Chassid, but he is a very serious scholar of Bratslav Chassidism, and I studied with him. It was a huge honor of mine to study with him. And I studied Likutei Maharan with him and other things. But one of the features of Bratslav Hasidim is that Bratslav taught that every day you should express your deepest fears, your deepest despair in your vernacular language. He said God understands every language. You don't have to remember also the Hasidim are dealing with people, they might know Hebrew prayers, but like many of us, they don't really understand what the Hebrew prayers meant. These were not highly educated people. So Nachman said, don't say it in Hebrew, say in whatever your vernacular language is, your deepest prayers, every day to God for an hour. And then the other 23 hours, he said in a famous sentence in Hebrew and now in English, he said, the other 23 hours, it's the greatest mitzvah. It's the greatest, your greatest mitzvah is to experience joy. He said, take that 1 hour a day to really express all the bad things. But then the other 23, your job is in order to be close to God. And Art Green used to say, this is 100 years before Freud. Bratslav understood, kind of God is the ultimate therapist, right? 1 hour a day, say all the bad things. And Art Green used to say, he lived with the Hasidim in Jerusalem when he was writing this book. And he said to them, this practice of going out, and Bratslav, I mean, they were living in Poland then, which was, of course, agrarian. He would say, go out to the fields. Don't do this in your house. Go out where you could see God's world, and go to the fields, speak in your vernacular, and say all your despair to God. So this is one of my favorite stories of all time. So Art Green asked the head of the Bratslav community. There is a hierarchy. There is a head of the community, even though they don't technically call him the Rebbe. Said to him, so it's a practice called in Hebrew hitbadadut or hitbadadut, which means, Yael, how would you translate that?
I would pronounce it hitbodedut, and
Okay.
it to be by yourself, to be
Right.
alone.
So they had this concept of every day to spend an hour in this practice. So Art said to the head of the community, so does this still happen? Is this what a Bratslav Chassid still does? And the guy said to him, well, it's the modern age. We say 50 minutes now. So I just love that. Anyway, so that's Nachman. That's a very fast overview of Nachman, and Psalm 16 is the first. And as I mentioned, we're speaking to Simcha Weintraub about coming. So Simcha took those 10 Psalms, starting with 16, and asked contemporary rabbis to write a commentary on each one, which is a very interesting practice. Now, there are a lot of controversial things about Nachman, which I won't entirely go into. There are many, many things to say, but I do want to read a little bit from Likutei Maharan about his, and this is what he teaches about the reciting of Psalms. It's from the first book. A person who wishes to return to God in repentance should make it a practice to recite Psalms. Psalms are most efficacious for repentance. The explanation for this is that many impediments to repentance exist. Some people have no awakening to a repentance at all, and even those who do have such an awakening may encounter any number of barriers. Many people find the gate to repentance closed before them, while other people may not know how to reach the gate that's appropriate for them, the one through which they must pass in order to return to God. There are many barriers that impede a person from repentance. such that he could squander his whole life and die without repenting, God forbid. However, an awakening may be achieved by reciting Psalms. Psalms will also help us reach the gate corresponding to our soul. I love that image, that there's a gate for our soul. And to hold this gate open and to hold this gate open until we merit returning to God in perfect repentance. Every day, and this is from the sermon from the first one, 1805. Every day say at least 10 Psalms. Any 10 Psalms you say have great power to fix. See yourself and what you are going through in the words of the Psalms. Apply all the expressions of praise and thanks in the Psalms to your personal situation. Say them as thanks to God for all the love and kindness God has shown to you. Rabbi Nachman was once speaking with someone about reciting Psalms. He said, it's very important for the person to say them to find himself in each Psalm. But what about if I don't feel so good? The man then asked the Rabbi Nachman how he could express his own feelings. The Rabbi said that a person must apply those verses to himself also. For a person must be judged favorably and find in himself some merit and good point, even in that relation he is indeed devout. There's much more. So anyway, this is just a fantastic example of where the Psalms are at the center of this Hasidic teaching, and the Psalms in general, but this Psalm in particular, which we'll start studying in serious focus tomorrow. So are there any questions or comments? I know that was a lot of information.
Well, the chat has been lighting up,
Okay.
but Yael had her hand up about 20 minutes ago. Yael?
Okay, sorry about that.
No.
Okay.
So in 1997 at the CBST retreat, we received this. I don't know if you guys can see
A
it.
little lower. Oh, okay. Yes.
Oh, I still have it at home.
Ah, beautiful. Yep.
Little sayings from
That's
Nachman. Always remember, joy is not merely incidental to your spiritual quest, it is vital, and so on and so forth.
So you see, I've loved Nachman for a long time. Nachman's verse also people sing a lot, which is the whole world is a narrow bridge, but the important thing is to not let fear overcome us. That's a Nachman saying. Wow. Yeah, I'm glad you remembered that. It's a wonderful little book of his sayings.
Sarah Siegel has her hand up.
Thanks. Hi. I remember you gave out, it was how I began the Psalm class in March before Harold and you were telling us to buy these different versions. You gave out at another retreat, a tiny baby size book. My question is probably for Yael as much as for you, Rabbi Kleinbaum. The Nachman graffiti all over Yerushalayim and Israel. What is that about? Is that related to this?
Yes, it's related. It's a subgroup of Bratslav Hasidim, and it would take too much time now. But I'd be happy to talk about it. But we don't. But it's a subgroup, and there's a gematria application to each of the words of Nachman. But yes, it's definitely Bratslav Hasidim.
So, Rabbi, I think that we should wrap up the conversation today and give the big announcement.
Okay.
Go ahead. Do you want to do it?
Okay, so we are very excited to announce, and we're going to talk more tomorrow, that on March 16th, which will mark 1 year of our study together and 1 year of the shutdown of CBST and New York, that Sherry and Harold are taking the leadership and chairing a group that I've very excited that we're going to have a program to have readings from our Psalms class, different presentations to the whole congregation as a way of acknowledging this 1 year anniversary and celebrating the Psalms class and the journey we've been on. And that we're going to talk more about it tomorrow, so stay tuned. And Harold, will we talk kind of at the end of class and then for people who...
Yeah,
can
we'll wrap
stay?
up class a few minutes early, Rabbi. You said you could stay until 11.
Yeah, I could stay till 11
We'll have an
tomorrow.
exhaustive, Sherry and I and Annika, who's the third member of our organizing team for this. We'll talk through all of the logistics, but it's very exciting. We're trying to include as many people as possible. It will be wonderful, and all of your questions will be answered tomorrow. So thank you.
And if people have other questions about today, because I know that I did a huge, I hope that was okay. I guess
So I'm gonna, everybody
I
wanted,
didn't watch chat, so I don't know if there were.
everybody's wanted to see chat, so I'm gonna distribute chat to everybody as soon as I get it from Tasha. And I already put all of the books that were mentioned on the the Psalms class Facebook page for people who are interested in them. And wow, Rabbi, what a fascinating, it feels like you could give a whole class just on Rabbi Nachman.
Oh, totally, totally. Are you kidding? Yes, I could definitely do a whole class on Nachman.
So Ira does have a beautiful play out for us. So all your questions will be answered tomorrow. Just be here tomorrow for the thing. Rabbi, thank you for a fascinating little digression here. How wonderful.
My
And
pleasure. I love
I
it.
turn it back over to Ira for his play out with Salomone Rossi.
Thank you, Harold. So we're playing out with Rossi's Psalm 118, which many of you know is part of Hallel, I believe, the one that starts Hodu Ladonai Ki Tov and ends that way. But Rossi set the last four lines of the psalm, which begin with Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. And again, it's a very, very beautiful setting. So let's listen.
I'm sorry, wrong one. Sorry. Okay, hold on. I apologize. I'm trying to get back. Excuse me, did the wrong thing. Let me get the right one. Here we go. My apologies. So tell us again what this is, Ira.
It's the last four verses from Psalm 118.
All right. Here we go. The right thing. Thank you, Ira, and thank you, everybody. A chat will go out shortly, and I'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you,
Anybody?
everybody. The room can stay open for about 5 minutes. Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Hi, Marilyn.